guy.
Scott Pilgrim Vs The World, directed by Edgar Wright, written by Edgar Wright, Michael Bacall and Brian Lee O'Malley. Scott Pilgrim is a classic coming-of-age story, but in the main character's early 20s. Adapted from the graphic novels of Brian Lee O'Malley, Scott is down on his luck and lives in his own fantasy world, full of computer game references, comic book stylings, and strange subspace highways.
You're not alone.
An alternative rock soundtrack weaves us through Scott's life as he tries to defeat Ramona's 7 evil exes. But who in the end is he really fighting for? Success in film can broadly be determined by the number of awards received and how significant the box office is. Unfortunately for Scott Pilgrim vs. The World, it cannot be seen as successful by these attributes. Instead, we should look at the adaptation of the source material itself and how being successful can be more about how faithfully the source material is adapted and what impact this has on the film's continuing success. So, what is adaptation? Adaptation is described as a work in one medium that derives its impulse as well as varying number of its elements from a work of a different medium. Konigsberg, 1997. So, why adaptation? A studio may view a well-established story with fleshed-out characters and a fan base as having an advantage over original material. Burke, in the comic book adaptation, states, paradigms that favour content with a pre-existing fan base and an amenability to franchise opportunities. What can be used to determine if Scott Pilgrim is a faithful adaptation of the source material? I believe it's appropriate we look at Hutchins' theory of adaptation, describing adaptive work as a derivation that is not a derivative, a work that is second without being secondary. Hutchin, 2006. Hutchin is an authoritative source on adaptation and is referred to in a large number of works, an example of which is shown here. Hutchin breaks down adaptation in 3 parts. An acknowledged transposition of recognisable other work or works, a creative and interpretive act of appropriation or salvaging, and extended intertextual engagement with the adapted work.
Can't wait to hear when it's finished.
So, taking Hutchins' first point, is Scott Pilgrim recognisable to the other work?
Scott Pilgrim was dating a high schooler.
Scott Pilgrim is dating a high schooler.
From the first frame of Scott Pilgrim, the graphic novel aesthetic is clear.
How old are you now, Scott? Like
The
28?
trees, the slow pan down with the text, the voiceover, are all directly taken from the first volume of the graphic novel series.
22. You're dating a high school girl. Not bad, not bad.
Thank you.
So what you guys like?
This continues with a small amount of trimming into the first band practice
We
and the
have
opening
done
title
many
sequence.
things. Okay, let's start with Launchpad McQuack.
That's not the actual title of the song.
The incorporation of both diegetic and extra-diegetic texts, split screens and hand-drawn sequences based on Lee O'Malley's original design results in a viewing experience that feels more like reading a comic book than watching a film. Woo, 2016. Early in the film, this shows to viewers that have a pre-existing relationship with the source material that we should expect not only a faithful adaptation of the narrative, but also its visual style and sense of world building.
Amazing.
For those who do not have this pre-existing knowledge, later in the film, Wright uses original panels from the graphic novel with voiceover as flashback.
And?
It was football season, and for some reason, all the little jocks wanted me. Matthew was the only non-white, non-jock boy in town. So the 2 of us joined forces, and we took them all down.
This shows new viewers that they are watching adapted material.
Nothing could beat Matthew.
If we can see early on that Scott Pilgrim is recreating O'Malley's aesthetic, what about Hutchinson's second criteria of being creative and interpretive act of appropriation or salvaging? The Scott Pilgrim vs. The World screenplay was completed prior to the graphic novel series being completed. To make sure that the story kept in line with O'Malley's original concept, he had laid out his vision of the entire narrative and trusted in Wright and Bacall to faithfully tell the story of 6 graphic novels into a single film.
By the time we were sort of making it, there were 3 books out, and Brian had the outlines for the final 3.
Wright as a director is known for having his own aesthetic and visual and audio style, come from years of media consuming and homaging to various genres of films, and this can be seen through his previous work. Consideration should be made that Wright frequently collaborates on projects, either with another screenwriter or a duo of screenwriters and himself as
Who are you
director.
texting?
Hello?
It's me, Richard.
Hello.
17 years old, scandal.
That's not true. Who told you?
Wallace, duh.
That gossipy bitch.
You know me.
Wallace!
Who is this mystery child you date?
Her name's Knives Chow. She's Chinese.
A 17-year-old Chinese schoolgirl? You're ridiculous.
Yes. Look, I can't really talk now.
Within this clip, we can see there is a definite style similarity in how Wright works and how this translates into the comic book stylings.
Why are you doing this?
In Bring the Noise, a sonic intensified continuity in the films of Edgar Wright. Talking about Scott Pilgrim, McQueen states, the film thus quite conspicuously employs both sound and image in these shots to evoke the comic book and video game tropes that drive Scott Pilgrim's overall narrative and style. We can also determine that the Scott Pilgrim version is much clearer and more defined in style, which we can equate to the writer's ability to merge his own creative style with that of the source material, and in turn create something that is an interpretive act of appropriation. Continuing with Hutchins' theory and intertextual engagement with the adaptive work. As previously mentioned, O'Malley continued to write and produce the graphic novel series whilst the screenplay was being created. And Wright and Bacall continued to reference these additions, and O'Malley was heavily involved in the process, with Wright commenting that
there are some comic book adaptations where the originators are not involved or don't want to be involved, and I think if that had been the case with Brian, I probably wouldn't have done the film.
this is a clear indication that Wright fully understands not only the need for an adaptation to be relevant to the intended end product, but also that it needs to remain faithful to the original. The graphic novels that O'Malley created after the theatrical release of Scott Pilgrim differ from what was on the original plan, and Wright believes that after the film was released, O'Malley had the flexibility to explore the world of Scott Pilgrim now that his story had been told once.
So what Brian eventually did was different from the outlines that we had. And that was fine, because I kind of felt like, well, this is okay for these things to diverge, you know, it is an adaptation.
O'Malley even backed this up, stating that Wright took and expanded the world that he created beyond what he could have imagined. An example of this is the twins fight. The final film version was based on an original idea of O'Malley's that he stated.
And then I was writing the script for Volume 5, which ended up being totally changed later, but they used a lot of the script for Volume 5, which had the Toronto Battle of the Bands and things like that. And I just didn't end up drawing it because it was way too hard to draw. And I was like, oh, you can just cast like 500 extras and I don't have to draw them? Like, never mind, you can do that, I'll do something else.
Not only does this show us the continued relationship with source material, but also in return, O'Malley has been influenced in his creative process by the film, and that the two mediums coexist and are ultimately telling the same story in multiple ways. What about another comic book adaptation, such as Batman Begins by Christopher Nolan? As a film, it did considerably better at box office, making it successful financially. However, it does not follow Hutchinson's theory, and is therefore not a faithful adaptation. Even though influence from Miller's Batman Year One and Liob's Batman The Long Halloween can be seen, these are more reference points for inspiration rather than faithful adaptation. On one level, Batman is everything he has ever been, a combination of 1,000 variations, and overlapping of alternates. Brooker, 2012. Batman, having already been adapted and expanded multiple times, needs to gather in all those existing audience relationships, and staying faithful to only one text could alienate a large, already existing audience and affect a film's reception. This shows that sometimes an adaptation cannot remain faithful to the source material in order to become successful. So where does this leave us? Scott Pilgrim vs. The World is still not a successful film in terms of box office return or awards. But, as explored by examining the film in line with the Hutchinson's theory of adaptation, we can determine that Scott Pilgrim vs. The World is a successful adaptation by being faithful to the source material. What does this mean regarding the continued life of Scott Pilgrim vs. The World? There has been a continued gain in viewership not only for the film but also the original graphic novels. There has been a re-release for the 10th anniversary, a computer game that was not only created for one game system but was updated for another, a host of Funko Pop figures, and even moving forward just announced as an adaptation into anime for Netflix, with the original cast returning to voice the characters. Without a faithful adaptation, there would not be the continued engagement with the material, and none of this expanded work possible. It seems that finally, as Universal put it to Edgar Wright shortly after a disappointing opening box office weekend, that Scott Pilgrim can now be considered as a film of years, not days.